Hello, guys. Can I just check? Can anyone hear me? Um, see me? Something? If somebody could just let me know if you can hear me or see me, that would be wonderful, for sure. Okay, bear with me just one moment. This has been a very accidental day, so please give me just one teeny tiny second, and we will be all okay. Oh boy. Right. Hopefully, can you see me now as well? Please say yes. Okay. Oh, okay, fine. My most sincere apologies. I've had a seriously difficult day, to say the least. Some of you may recall from I need to turn the PowerPoint on. From the other day, I've had some serious problems with my flat. We've been flooding essentially, and my computer isn't charging. Bear with me. Okay, we're good now. So there's been some serious problems with my flat. We've had some flooding, and today they came to the repairs. At some point, they just switched off all power, but they didn't let us know. So I've been here waiting for the power to come back, and I've not been able to actually get here or do anything until just now. So I'm very, very sorry. We're literally like half an hour late, but we're here now. It's obvious that every time I try to do my Romanesque session, the universe just doesn't want us to. I am sincerely very sorry. Well, if you just give me one second, I'm just loading the PowerPoint. It's literally just right there. And for some reason, although I have disabled the waiting room, Zoom just keeps on telling me that there are still people waiting. So I just want to make sure that everything is fine. My most sincere apologies in here, because I don't know why it should be fine now. Okay, that should be one problem sorted. Well, you guys say no apology needed, but to me, I take these things very seriously. I don't like it when things don't go well. So, as a matter of fact, please do take my most sincere apologies. And hello, everybody that has so very kindly been waiting and, actually making time for me. We're just about to get started. I'm just getting the PowerPoint to load because, of course, as you know, it takes a few moments in here. So anyway, we will be rolling just very quickly. I hope you're all having a very good Monday and beginning of your day. Because obviously over here we could be doing much better. But anyway, we are gonna be doing now our session on Romanesque, whether the universe wants it or not. I've put too much time and effort into this thing. So the PowerPoint is just about to load that into the screen. I just want to do one final check that the chat is working. I see that it's working for the majority of you, and I just want to make sure. Let me just double check that the waiting room is indeed disabled, because it just keeps on telling me. I don't know if maybe somebody's just gotten stuck in. I'll say it, in the loop of the of Zoom telling me whether it's okay or not. So right, I think that's all good now. Seems happy with me now. So we can get started. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being patient with me. We can now roll properly here with all of this. And before I close the chat and all of that, I'm going to start sharing the PowerPoint just so I know that you all can see it. So if you can let me that the screen is sharing on your end, because it's telling me it is sharing already, but I don't know if it's just being delayed or whatever. So if somebody could confirm in the chat that you can see my screen, that would be awesome. Awesome. Excellent. Thank you so much. Brilliant. In which case, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being the most patient and the most kind. My most sincere apologies for all of this awful stuff that has been happening. But here we are. We're going to do the lecture. We're going to go ahead. The show must go on. So In case that you don't know me, normally I'm not this mess. Normally I'm much, much more on top of things. But this is indeed Dr. Lilian Cespedes Gonzalez. And it's doctor because, believe it or not, I do actually have a PhD in history. When the universe is not destroying my living quarters, I can actually be quite smart about these things. And today we're actually going to be doing the session on Romanesque that had to be postponed from the and actually I've just started sharing the wrong PowerPoint. I just realized that was before Romanesque, not Romanesque. So we are starting good. So we are indeed doing the Romanesque session that had to be postponed because, well, I was ill on the day when we were supposed to do all this originally. So the session today essentially fits in between session 1 and Gothic. So it is entirely out of order. But do not worry if you actually didn't catch any of the others, they are on YouTube still. You can, have a look in there yet. You will be able to watch this very messy presentation in the meantime too. And well, in the chat now are the links in which you can also help everything that we do here on World Virtual Tours through your donations via PayPal and Stripe, and the upcoming new tours that we have over the next few months. And since everything seems to be working just now, yeah, the lectures on YouTube will be on for another week or so, so you still have time. And since everything seems to be more or less working now, and obviously we're running out of time, I'm gonna close the chat and we're gonna get started this time with the right PowerPoint. Here we go. Excellent. Yay, Romanesque. Awesome. Well, so I don't have an introduction slide for today. We're simply just gonna get started. Even if I had it, we're just gonna try and get through this at a relatively good speed because I don't want to collide with any more plans. So Romanesque. Let's start with a little bit of context because otherwise none of this would make sense. So the periods of the Romanesque coincide with the 11th and 12th centuries in Europe and abroad. However, of course, we're only looking at this from a European perspective. And this is actually a very difficult period in European history. There's a lot of war. And not just war in Europe, there is a lot of war abroad, because in case that you've done the maths already, this is the moment in time when the Crusades happen. So, of course, as a result, European nations are going to be involved in their wars at home and then over in the Holy Land, which overall causes a variety of social, political, and religious changes, which are going to affect, of course, the general state of affairs. This also coincides with the period for nation making in Europe. The majority of the states that are now European countries, as to speak, are starting to finally put their, proper pillars into the earth. And this is happening through new ideas, which is what we call feudalization. Now, feudalization or feudalism is the process through which the majority of European states and in other parts of the world as well start exercising control on a tier basis society where the lord and the clergy are at the top and then peasants tend to be at the bottom. Depending on which country in Europe we're looking at, there are interim classes normally created by merchants or artisans, but that's how it happens. The feudal lord, as a result, is a lord that collects taxes, that collects conscription from his, kingdom, and therefore it's a very different type of political and national institution than what we've seen in the early Middle Ages. Because although, of course, there have been lords and kings and armies, they were not maintained in the same way. They did not have the same structure and they did not have the same needs. So this is where it all comes from. And as a result, the church is obviously going to be a very strong role model to actually, keep everybody in check, both lords and peasants alike. In the midst of all of this, Romanesques come through as a way of essentially, just trying to make sense of it all and trying to give it all an architectural context. Because as you know, art reflects the changes in society, the things that have been happening. So, what does Romanesque actually mean? Well, the word only appears in the 19th century, properly speaking, at the same time when we start seeing the linguistic foundations of Europe cropping through. And in the same way that we call the Latin base or Latin root languages Romance languages, We kind of do the same with architecture and art. Romanesque, which kind of means something alike Roman or Latin foundations. And this is very important, not just from the point of view of, the vocabulary and the words that we use around it, but it's also very important from the point of view of legitimacy and nation making. Like I was saying, all of these new states are cropping through. They are becoming, powerful and trying to delineate their states and their general, areas of influence. If any of those states can claim any connection to the Roman Empire, this is super important because Rome, of course, is perceived to be at this moment in time the epitome of power in Europe. And if you recall, Rome still has a legacy in the Eastern Roman Empire in Byzantium. So everybody wants to essentially want to be the new version of that empire. So any connections that you can draw to the past, you can utilize as political propaganda to create your new base of power. So that is where the language comes from and why it's utilized in this way. However, and although the word itself and the concept don't appear until the 19th century, as I was going to say, as earlier or as late as the 15th and 16th century, we already see members of society and academics making the difference between Romanesque and Gothic, because the art styles are going to be, of course, not the same. And well, a final thing before we move from the context phase is that, well, as much as Romanesque is really an international kind of art style and architectural style, it's not a monolith. There are lots of regional variants, although the majority of them are pretty homogeneous and, have key features that are shared. We're going to see some examples from different countries that, of course, are going to demonstrate the different influences that every single country develops at this moment in time. Well, now, the most important part of Romanesque, in many ways, or allegedly, is everything that relates to architecture and the church. And here you have the modelic church of them all in terms of Romanesque architecture. Is a church abbey which doesn't really exist anymore. It's all in ruins in France, in the area of Cluny. And well, in many ways, the church and the architecture of the church are the epitome of anything that Romanesque has to give. It is both a representation of culture and aesthetics at the same time and religious message. So it's sort of, a huge book for the illiterate, if you see what I mean, because we are going to have architectural features, sculpture, and art all mingle in one place with the same message being sent over to the people. So these buildings have a religious function for liturgy, of course, but they're also educational. And they are as well a symbol of power, because in order to start making these huge constructions, you're going to need to spend a lot of money. If you may recall from our very first lecture, pre-Romanesque churches tended to be a lot smaller. So here we start seeing really dimensions reaching new heights. Well, why is the church so important aside from its, educational agenda and whatnot? Well, at this moment in time, like I was saying, there are many different changes in Europe. And one of those changes has to do with the appearance of new monastic orders and religious orders. And one of those is going to be the Benedictine monks. The Benedictine monks had actually been operating in Europe for quite some time. But at this moment, they are going to realize, or at least come to the realization, that a lot of religious orders in Europe were not following their rules properly. Different monks, different nuns follow different canons, but the canons are written down and you're supposed to, behave accordingly. They sort of come to this conclusion that there is a general disparity and something needs to change. So Benedictine monks kind of become a bit of sticklers for rules and start applying them to a very, very ultimate core, which even includes liturgy and construction. Because churches in the Middle Ages, as they were for a long period of time, were built for a purpose. You could not create the same kind of mass in a church from the 8th century than one from the 11th century. Because these orders had developed so much, the rituals had changed altogether. And as such, the church needed to have dedicated spaces for all of those different rituals. So that's why with the rise of the Benedictine orders, we see a lot of, new churches coming up. It's something that we see later on, and you may recall from our class with Gothic and the Cistercian monks. As changes happen, new architecture comes with it. Well, the other very important aspect of this monastic upheaval, of course, is the fact that this is the period of the Crusades. The monks and the general monastic orders are gonna push for piety quite a lot, so the political and religious ideas mingle together. And more importantly, this is also a high period for pilgrimage. The Middle Ages overall is going to be a great period for pilgrimage, but the 11th and 12th century particularly more so because of the constant state of war and the constant state of turmoil. You go to pray to a specific saint, hoping that your prayers will be answered and things will get better, essentially. So all of these elements combined are what give these churches such a high importance. And the key features of these churches that you can see very well represented here in the Abbey of Cluny are the cross shape, the Latin cross shape kind of structure, although sometimes we find square churches in the shape of basilicas, solid stone walls, the round windows and the vaults will be known in here as canon vaults because they create that kind of shape, and of course the monumental facades. Well, I could carry on talking about this just randomly, but instead it would be better if I show you some examples. So here you have a stereotypical cross shape of what any church in Europe look at this moment in time. This is the example from Speyer Cathedral, of which we're going to talk a lot more in a few moments. There were some deviations from this model, depending on potentially how many more chapels they may have at the top, but this was pretty classic. And at the bottom, you see where the two crosses are, there were normally towers. This was not something that we saw in pre-Romanesque cathedrals, or if it happened, maybe there was just one tower. In Romanesque, it's quite typical that you see two at the bottom. So when you go into a church, it's the first thing that you see, and it's actually quite imposing. This all makes perfect sense because Romanesque cathedrals and churches overall, due to their smaller window openings in the round shape, they tend to be darker spaces. And because they're so solid, because they're normally built, with stone or at least quite, brusque materials, the idea behind it is essentially that you are coming to church to be judged. God is not necessarily your friend in the 11th and 12th century. He is your judge and punisher. And that is the reason why the interior of these churches is normally quite dark. The idea is that you go inside and you feel so in awe by the sheer depth and strength of the structure and the kind of penumbra that develops in its atmosphere that you want to expiate your sins very quickly. So as you see, there was a definite agenda that was imposed in here, and architecture, well, has the power to make people feel one way or another. That's the reason why they build them that way. Well, in terms of decoration and other features, we start seeing a huge development in what we call the monumental facade. The vast majority of main entrances to cathedrals at this moment in time are not just going to be, super strong pieces of stone. As you see, they have lots of decorations. This is quite a particularly good example, one that I've had the absolute pleasure of visiting, the cathedral in Angoulême, which, by the way, contains a total of 70 sculptures in this facade, which, as you can see, is quite prolific. The type of topics that we see in these sculptural facades normally are biblical components, often New Testament or Old Testament. The vast majority of the time, the element of the Last Judgment is, of course, widespread because of the idea that we were already mentioning of the fear of God and repenting. But we see other type of messages. The Passion of Christ is something that we see quite a lot in Romanesque cathedrals as well, outside and in, since that process of, I guess, the whole idea of the Calvary is a very important, aspect of liturgy. you repent for your sins, and in a way, you're sort of recreating the struggles, the trials and tribulations that Christ went through. So all of that is reinforcing the same message. Behave, be a good Christian, because otherwise, well, punishment will come. And why there is this obsession? Well, because remember that Romanesque starts literally with the year 1000. And people kind of went a little bit crazy in Europe and in the whole world. I'm sure many of you remember the year 2000, when we changed millennium again, and some people kind of thought all kind of conspiracy theories. Well, it was kind of the same in the Middle Ages. And because in the Bible, there was kind of the implication that judgment day will come and it would be so many, many years. For some people, 1000 years in a calendar, it was good enough. So there was this genuine fear that catastrophe was happening. When then you turn the page of the century and you see so much upheaval everywhere, so much war, well, then you start believing that indeed Judgment Day is here. And that's why all of the architecture and sculpture emulates this kind of subject. Well, we have other important architectural features that come through, like in the example of Collegiate Church, which, by the way, is in Poland. Now, as you see, this is a smaller church, but still is pretty strong. And Tum is perhaps the best example, or one of the best examples that we have in Europe for what we call encastellation. So let me explain what this big word is. Now, I'm sure you may have noticed the castle part of the encapsulation in here. Well, through the process of feudalism, as we're going to see, castles are obviously very important. They start cropping up everywhere in the landscape. So some communities are not going to have the money for castles. Maybe their lord is the church instead of a feudal lord. Instead, the church becomes the most important aspect of a community from the point of view of a building, of a structure. So instead of building both a castle and a church, they create a church with some castle-like features for the sake of protecting that community. The idea is that if some kind of disaster went to happen, people could hide in, the church, not just because it's protected by God, because quite frankly, if this is built with solid stone walls and your house is made of wood, you're gonna go here. So this is the important development in architecture we see in the 11th and 12th century. The solid component of almost indestructible buildings is something that is appealing for both the church and the civil society. And well, then we see some regional styles. So like I mentioned, it's not a monolith. And actually the Basilica of San Ambrogio in Milan is probably one of those best examples. As you see, it's a beautiful church. It follows a lot of these features that we have mentioned so far, but it has something slightly different, right? Well, the reason for that is because this is probably the oldest church in Milan and definitely the second most important outside of the cathedral. And in reality, the church was actually built in the 4th century AD, if I remember correctly, in the middle of the 300s, but it gets entirely rebuilt in the 11th and 12th century with a twist. The majority of what you see there is indeed Romanesque, but it has a very heavy influence from the early Christian liturgy and architecture that we find, which is essentially relying on Roman standards. So in many ways, we see a lot of similarities, I guess, between the Basilica of San Ambrogio and a lot of Byzantine churches, because they are borrowing from that classical legacy, if you see what I mean. Well, other than that, the best example of Romanesque architecture, like this is completely, something that there is no debate about, is this. One of my favorite buildings in the whole world, Spire Cathedral. This cathedral is honestly something that everybody should see at some point in their lives. If you're interested in architecture, you must, because it will quite literally turn your world upside down. Well, Spire Cathedral officially carries the name of the Imperial Cathedral Basilica of the Assumption and St. Stephen, just because why not? And one of the reasons for that is because this is indeed the burial site for several dynastic lineages of the rulers of Germany and Central Europe. We have the Salian dynasty in here, the Staufen, and some Habsburg burials here as well. This was essentially the seat of the Holy Roman Empire for the vast majority of, early European history in that regards. Well, the cathedral itself started to be built in 1030, so it's a relatively early, example. And as you see, it's done in this beautiful red sandstone, which is quite remarkable and a little bit different from what we normally associate Romanesque with, which is technically, limestone, which is often porous white and yellow rather than this very smooth type of architecture. So that gives it an extra point to its favor. It's obviously distinct from that viewpoint. And we actually consider this in many ways the epitome of Romanesque architecture. Although it started being built in the 1030s, it's not going to be finished until way into the 12th century, nearly 13th century. And it was built in 3 phases. There will be some more in years later due to renovations and what have you not. But well, there were some changes to the layout that were perceived to be better for the durability of the church more than anything else, and for some aesthetic reasons, because on top of the beautiful material that you see here, one of the most outstanding things of Spire is this height. I mean, look at where the floor is and look at how far up into the sky those arches goes. This is not normal in Romanesque architecture. This is something that we expect in Gothic because of the lightness, the buttresses that actually help us create this, a very elevated building. But in Spire, they managed to do this with different techniques by lowering the floors, sort of ditching them into a big pit, making a huge crypt right underneath it, and then bringing up those archways as far as they can. It's, I mean, in terms of decoration, the majority of the decoration on the walls is now relatively modern, and it kind of takes away from just the virtue of the cathedral itself. But I promise you, it's a very dwarfing experience. I mean, last time I was here, I was a 15-year-old, and I was smaller than what I am now. But all I remember was just simply looking around me, being like, it almost felt surreal in terms of dimensions. It's sincerely huge. And it's not just the fact that it's tall, it's also very, very long. It's 134, I believe, meters in distance. It's really, really massive in that regards. So with the dimensions really being blown out of proportion, all of the key elements of Romanesque really get highlighted. And well, here in the back, you can also see those classical towers. Now, in the case of Spire, we actually have 4 towers, and that is part of the later renovation in the late Romanesque. The towers that you see here at the back are actually added in the late 12th century just to keep symmetry with the ones at the top. This is something just typical of Spire. It's not something that we see everywhere, but it gives it that characteristic look, which of course, for a cathedral of this imperial, status was very important, just to add a bit of panache. And in fact, the desire for panache actually got Spire Cathedral in a few issues during the Middle Ages with the Pope, because in order to make the general area larger, you needed to ask for more land permissions. The town of Spire at this moment in time had a total of 500 inhabitants, and the Pope simply believed that it was crazy to ask for an even larger cathedral with more things on it for 500 people. But from the point of view of the imperial agenda, it was very important. So once again, religion and politics come together when it's down to Romanesque. And finally, as I was mentioning, the crypt in Spire is actually one of the largest crypts that we have in all of Europe. It is 7 meters in height, so it doesn't really feel like a crypt. It's almost like a whole other church underneath the church. It's like Churchception, right? From the movie Inception. It's kind of crazy. And the actual area for the whole crypt itself, just the crypt, is 850 square meters. It's massive. The echo, the musicality of the whole space is really something mind-blowing. And it's no surprising, of course, that in these kind of churches, organ music and in general religious music will really take a big hold, because, well, if you have the space for it, why not? So overall, this is a UNESCO heritage site. It is considered one of the best examples of Romanesque architecture in Europe, and indeed it is the largest still standing church from this time period. And I say still standing because we do have actually a few other ruins, like the Cluniac Abbey of Cluny in France, but there is literally just the archaeological outline. So sure, we can extrapolate how big it was, but it's no longer there, so we cannot really give it that title. So that's why Spire is so, so important in these regards. Well, let's move on to other buildings, because the thing is, churches are important and all that, but Romanesque was used for literally everything at this moment in time. And the thing is, a lot of the other buildings where we see the style developing just don't happen to be preserved. But castles, of course, are going to be super important for the development of the High Middle Ages and the Romanesque style specifically. Now, here you see unfortunately, now a ruin castle of Rochester. Rochester Castle is here in the area of Kent in the UK. If you ever come across, what a lot of people do is go visit Canterbury and then go over to Rochester. And it's actually, a beautiful ruin, despite not being in full. You can still see a lot of the decoration here. And actually, in the archways, you see the most typical Romanesque motif decoration that the Normans started developing. Is this kind of crisscross that you see all over, those teeth, I guess some other people have called them. That's one of the most classic, alongside with the chess pattern, which is, sort of squares that have one relief up, one relief down, and create that idea of texture. Well, Rochester Castle is actually an entire stone keep, perhaps the best preserved example of what a stone keep should be from the 12th century of both England, France, and any other Norman lands. So, although not in one piece, you get the idea of how massive and how well built this entire thing was. From records from the Middle Ages, we actually think that the castle had a total capacity for 60 night fees. And the fees are not just the money that you pay on behalf of every knight for upkeep, but of course the accompanying soldiers and retinue that comes with them. So that's how big this would have been. We have another example, very good example in Spain, in the area of Aragon, which is the castle of Loarre. And this is a photo that I took myself when I was recently on holiday there. So that's just the tour group that was coming with me. But as you see, this is not just the castle at the top, it's the whole fortress. In fact, it is considered the best preserved Romanesque fortress in all of Europe at this moment in time. The exterior line is something like 10,000 meters. It's insane. Well, why so many castles and why in all of these places? And by the way, now that I'm on the topic, so you understand the importance of these castles. In Loarre is where they actually filmed a great part of the Kingdom of Heaven with Orlando Bloom, this film about the Crusades. Well, precisely because of the Crusades, castles appear everywhere. Those of you who have done the Academy of the Normans with me would probably know this already, but consider that these two best examples of castles come from two countries where warfare was constant. Spain is still going through the process of the Reconquista, and indeed Aragon was a frontier. Remember that the Muslim kingdom of Al-Andalus got all the way up to the Pyrenees. So that's why we find so many castles around that area. And likewise, with the Normans arriving into England and literally conquering a whole new country, well, they needed to impose their military structure. So these are just two very good examples. Of course, with the Crusades, many more castles are developed, but often outside of Europe. And since, well, I didn't think it was appropriate using Crac de Chevaliers as a key icon for European history, these are the other two that really sort of, tick the box. The problem with castles, of course, particularly castles of this time period, is because they saw so much war, not many of them survive. And if they do survive, they are normally in an even worse state of repair than Rochester. So you cannot even, I mean, I can tell you it's a Romanesque castle, but you will not see any defining features. But the importance of these castles were not just for the sake of protection. You know, the castle, for a lot of these families, it was a symbol of power once again. It worked also as an administration post to collect taxes from the peasants, and it controlled the landscape. It's sending another visual message. So just like the church is telling you, you need to learn this message about God, the castle is telling you, beware. This is where trouble could potentially come and happen. So we see the two dichotomies of this medieval society rising up at the same time. But it's not just castles and churches, as much as that may seem the case. We have some examples of civic buildings. Very rare, but we have some. This one, a Perek house in Croatia, is a very good example. An ordinary house of a very wealthy member of the community, of course. The top level, particularly, is very heavily restored, but this is from the late 12th century. And it's not usual that we have these kind of buildings because, you know, the houses of ordinary people tend to be rebuilt over so many periods of time. But just because we don't see them, it doesn't mean they didn't exist. And another good example is this one from Ghent, the Korenstapel Huis. Well, this is perhaps, well, in fact, without the perhaps, the best example, or one of the best examples, if not, in terms of preservation, of a civic building that we have in all of Europe. It was actually a storehouse for grain. That's pretty much the role that it fulfilled until the 18th century. And as you see, well, it's the same structure, a lot of openings in the shape of a, you know, round archway for those windows, stone facing the walls, and a very solid structure. Well, in the case of actually the example in Ghent is also one of the oldest buildings of this character that we have in the area, and everything in there is done with granite as well as limestone from Tournai. So again, very solid materials, very important and precious materials that go to highlight once again how much money went into these buildings. And just for the sake of irony, I will tell you, I'm pretty confident nowadays this building is a hamburger restaurant. But you know, it's still in use, even though not as a historical building. There's been some restorations, but we're talking of minimal, because that goes to attest how well built Romanesque constructions were done. They were done to last, in part just like they had learned from the Romans, right? That's where the idea also comes from. Well, I can't remember exactly where we started this, but I suspect I'm probably past the halfway point. So apologies for the scatterbrain with everything else that's been going on. But I will drop in there now the links to the upcoming tours and the ways you can keep on contributing to the projects here on World Virtual Tours, and particularly the Free Academy. So wrapping up this Romanesque session, here we have the subject of art, because so far I've only spoken about architecture, and it is true that architecture is the most remarkable thing about this, but of course, it's not just that. So the vast majority of art in this moment in time is going to be entirely, or at least partially, subjugated to architectural developments. So even if it's sculpture or paintings, they are normally taking place in a church within the context of the architecture itself. So that's why normally architecture takes precedence, but it doesn't mean that art did not exist. In fact, the art of the 11th and 12th century is quite prolific. Now, the iconography that we see in this type of art is very didactic. Once again, it's all for the sake of sending the message of the Bible and the message of Christ. Different versions of that message, but the same message nonetheless. And once again, in here, we see often quite repeated the topics of the Passion of Christ and the Last Judgment. Now, what is very important that you understand is that Romanesque art, whether it's paintings or sculpture, it's idealized pictures. They are not true or realistic representations of the bodies, of the images that they're trying to promote. They are conventions, because through conventions, things ended up having, certain shapes that even illiterate people could identify as meaning XYZ. And as a result, they could use them and exploit them to pass those messages on. So a lot of people sort of deem the art before Gothic as being dull and without any kind of character because of the lack of distinctive features. It is not actually at all that way. It's just utilized in a slightly different context. And that's why it tends to be perhaps a bit more two-dimensional or emotionless, because the message is going to get across whether Christ is smiling or whether he is completely sad, if you see what I mean. People will know that is Jesus, period. As long as they know that is Jesus and what it means, that's all that matters. So it's a little bit tricky to understand this kind of art, because from our modern perspective it can seem a little bit abstract. And the other problem that we have is that, well, in the Middle Ages all of these would be polychrome. These would all have been painted, and in fact here in the tympanum of Vézelay you can see edges on the top of that rim where we still have original pigment. So that's an example of, features that we have lost that are taken away from our understanding of these elements. Well, these two examples that I've put in here, I thought were probably best representatives of the general art of the 11th and 12th century. The tympanum of Vézelay is famous because, well, Vézelay Abbey is actually a UNESCO heritage site. It's very important, but this is a very different tympanum than what you would see anywhere else in Europe. And by the way, the tympanum is specifically the part of the sculpture that you find right on the doorway as you're going inside the church. It always has that sort of semicircle, and it's normally a representation of the Last Judgment, except not in here. It may look like a representation of the Last Judgment. I'm sure you can see, Christ with his hands open and people around him, but this abbey and the tympanum specifically are built in 1130, and there is the background of the Crusades always in connection to this church. The interpretation of this tympanum actually says that what you're seeing here is not necessarily Christ passing judgment and, putting order in the heavenly cycles. Instead, it is Christ calling people to war, welcoming and sending those crusaders away. Can you see that all around the edge there is like lots of men in what seems to be armor and, with spears, sometimes some horses? Those are not just random pilgrims that are coming here for the sake of pilgrimage. Many of them are actually soldiers. And that's exactly the political, religious context and message that, unlike in many other churches, we see here. On some of the edges, you also see representations of some very early Pentecostal message and ideology, but for the vast majority, this is actually a political message. Interestingly, or perhaps for the sake of context, you will not be surprised to find out that the Second Crusade was actually called from the Abbey of Vézelay, and in the third crusade, the abbey is one of the staging points for the crusade itself. In fact, Richard Richard the Lionheart, and Philip of France will meet here and join forces on their way to the Holy Land. So, as you see, the message of this abbey is different because the context is very special. And, well, on the other side, we have a very important church in Spain. This is San Martín de Tours en Fromista, which is in Palencia in the north of Spain. And one of the best things about this church is not just the fact that inside and out is a classic Romanesque church, but it has lots of capitals still in a perfect state of repair. Now, what you see here is just one of those many. They were actually carved entirely into the stone, and it's just proof of the degree of decoration, of detail, and overall mastery that these medieval artisans had, and how, once again, sculpture is actually used for the interpretation of the Middle Ages. And I believe that actually we need to wrap up because I'm pretty confident that the next tour is about to start. I cannot see my clock here on the screen, but yes, I think this is pretty much all we're going to have time for, unfortunately. So before I do that, just very quickly, some pretty pictures while I open the chat and say goodbye, because this is the only couple of things that I had to show you, which are some reliquaries and some paintings. So my apologies, since we cannot finish this properly as a result of my house being a mess. But anyway, I've just opened the chat just to give you one last chance to say hello. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for dealing with all of the issues in here today. And I will be just dropping in here one last time the, I'll say it, the links into the chat so that you can keep on supporting everything that we do here in World Virtual Tours. And on that note, once again, my most sincere apologies for all the troubles today. Have a lovely rest of your day, and hopefully we will do this again so I can finish this presentation properly. And in fact, I think they are, Emiliano and Luis are probably right here to make sure that I am leaving. So see you guys later. Thank you so much for all your support, and let's see if Zoom can actually let me finish